As we continue on in Luke, we come this morning to a parable of Jesus that's typically referred to as the parable of the bad tenants or the parable of the wicked vine dressers. So as we approach this story that Jesus told, he told stories that would connect with people. Jesus knew how to engage and connect with his audience. And a lot of his parables were about farming and agriculture, as it was talking and living in a largely agricultural society, where it's estimated that back then that about 70% of the population worked in agriculture. And if you've been around farmers, I grew up with friends that owned dairy farms, and when you're with them, they talk a lot about farming, just talking shop. It's their lifestyle. I wonder if Jesus was here today, what his parables would look like, what he would connect with. Maybe there'd be a parable about getting sent to the HR department, or the bad boss at the water cooler type of parables. But he talks about farming, and this one here, it's both a farming one and a landlord-tenant one. So I might be coming at it from a different perspective than other pastors. What does that mean? Well, in addition to working in ministry, I've also worked in real estate and property management. And for a while, one job I had as vice president at a property management firm. The owner of the company owned about 500 units of rental housing, apartments, and he wanted to start a division managing for other people, to keep his staff busier and build up his company more. So I was brought in, and my job was largely to go bring apartment buildings under management. And so part of that, I spent most of my time in that job writing magazine articles, speaking at Property Management Association meetings. And he was going after a pretty wide territory. We're based in Sonoma County, but there was a California Apartment Association in Sonoma County, another in Marin County, one in San Francisco, a couple of them in the East Bay. There's one in Sacramento and one in San Jose. And so almost all of them had a monthly meeting plus bigger annual conventions. So I was trying to go to all these meetings. And I'd say the most popular topic was evictions, because it's a thing they all face. Having that many units under management, the company did about 8 evictions a month. And so there were eviction topics as well as screening topics of how to get good tenants in your property, how to screen them. It was never rent. You learn pretty quickly, never rent to somebody without running a credit check, verifying income, talking to past landlords. Not the one that they're leaving. The one they're leaving will sometimes lie because they want to get rid of them. But the one before that is key, of hearing to see, did they ever, were they ever late? Did they ever miss payments? And a lot of these meetings had a legal panel, and the legal panel, 2/3 of the question were eviction oriented. Now, if you live in California, California's harder to manage in, and it's harder to get rid of people who don't pay. So if you ever find yourself in that sort of situation, definitely advise getting a lawyer. But at some of the annual meetings, the lawyers and some owners would tell property management horror stories of bad tenants. Well, Jesus' story takes the cake. for bad tenants as we're going to get into it. Maybe one of the best ones I heard was a Sonoma County attorney. I think my dad had met Chuck Jensen too, but he had said that there were some tenants that were renting a property out in the country, some acreage, and they declared themselves to be a sovereign nation and stopped paying, and said that the laws of California and the United States did not apply to them because they were now their own sovereign country, and they had built a fence around it and built a watchtower and were ready, willing, and able to defend their new country. So they stopped paying, so they went through the legal eviction process and had the attorney went with them along with the sheriff's department, and they had one of those military type vehicles that the SWAT team would use, and they brought the SWAT team and they were telling them with a loudspeaker to come out. The people were armed on the other side, and the sheriff's assault vehicle finally ended up mowing down their fence that they built to go in, and as soon as that happened, all the people dropped their guns and fled. So, but Jesus' story here is better. Luke chapter 20, starting at verse 9. Worst landlord-tenant horror story I've heard. He went on to tell the people this parable. So here he's still addressing a crowd. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. So this has been a common arrangement, and we don't see it quite as much anymore. But a man owned a vineyard, he owned a property. It says that he planted the vineyard and rented it to farmers to take care of it. So this seemed to be easy, that they didn't even have to do the work of planting the crop and waiting for it to grow. But the vineyard's there. All they have to do is pull weeds, harvest the fruit, keep it watered. And he went away, and the arrangement, which was a popular arrangement then, was sharecropping. Maybe you learned about sharecropping, as it's been popular in our country more until modern times, but definitely in colonial times and during the Civil War era, there was a lot of sharecropping. And the way that works, if you rent a property to somebody, you can give them a high chance of succeeding if the rent payment isn't fixed, but it's just a portion of the crop. The rent payment might be a quarter or a tenth of what they harvest that year. So if they have a bad harvest year, they're not on the hook for a payment they can't afford, as they're just giving a portion of the produce. So here they would be paying in either grapes or wine. So that said, so they only pay rent probably one time a year during harvest season. So during harvest season, he sends his servant to the tenants to get the portion of the fruit that they had previously agreed upon. Seems like a pretty good deal if you don't own land, especially if you get an established vineyard. You work the land and you pay a portion. So if you have a good year, you pay a lot of fruit. If you have a bad year, you just pay a portion of what you collect. So, common arrangement in an agrarian society. So, the servant goes to collect. It says, but the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that also they beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Interesting that landlord-tenant tensions were problematic back then in the first century, just as they are now. A big part of my sales pitch was that California has gotten really cumbersome with their laws, and property management had become very technical. Everybody that has several rental units has problem people that can cause them a lot of stress as well as money. So knowing the right way to deal with them is key. So part of the sales pitch was just like, hey, tired of dealing with the headaches of bad tenants, our company will do that for you, and you don't have to deal with that anymore. So that sounded good to a lot of people. People, when it's time to collect and they're not paying, get really, really angry. And sometimes that's the worst part of the job, that part of dealing with people that are angry. A lot of people don't take responsibility for their lives and their problems and need somebody else to blame. Hating the landlord, is just a way a lot of the time. Even there are a lot of good ones out there. Yeah, there are some bad ones that that can give things a bad name, just as with any business. But definitely, like, hating the landlord is a popular thing. Another thing is knowing how to deal with the problems, as technical as it is. When looking at it, when pursuing an eviction, there are so many technical steps where if you do one step wrong, it starts the whole process over, which sometimes can take months here. So they're beating the servants that are going to collect. It might sound far-fetched, but definitely can happen. One thing that was always a little awkward, a couple times the company needed help. A building was being sold. Buildings were on the market in an escrow and were about to sell. And so I got brought in a few times of, hey, we need help. This building is going to sell next week. There are a lot of people that are behind on rent. I want you to go knock on all those doors and see what you could get, because once the building's sold, we'll never see any of that money again. So I got to be the man in the suit, knocking on doors to say that, hey, the rent's behind and headquarters sent me over, and just want to see what's going on and if you're able to pay any of that. And in some cases, we let them take it out of the security deposit before the building sold. So yeah, some people were really grateful for that. Some people were just really, really angry and needing something to blame. And sometimes there are just sad stories of good people that lose their jobs and have problems. So trying to sort that out here, though, the servant comes to collect. They not only don't pay and send them away, but they beat them up. Second one is sent. They do the same thing. A third one sent. He gets beat up. I don't think we know exactly how the police worked back then, with it being Roman soldiers, and how much they would get involved in matters like this. But the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my son whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. "This is the heir," they said. "Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. The owner might have said, well, perhaps they thought that these servants weren't actually from me, so I'll send my son to collect. Perhaps they know him, maybe they'll recognize him. Surely they'll respect him, as the owner might have been giving them the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps they thought it was a scam, scammers coming to collect. There have always been scams in rentals. I started working on writing an article about scams in property management, and I wrote part of the article, but then before I was done, I stopped and said, I've heard so many things, I don't even want to put this out there because scammers are going to get a hold of it and learn some new tricks. So because of my conscience, I can't publish this because it probably will fall into the wrong hands. I talked about some of them at some of the meetings that we went to that were all, other owners and managers, but I didn't want to put that out there in writing for people to get their hands on. There are things that happen now like vacant homes. People break into vacant homes, change the locks, put new locks on them, pretend to be a property manager or owner, and rent it to people and collect a large security deposit and first month's rent. They usually insist upon cashier's checks, or cash, so that it's not traceable, and then they disappear, never to be seen from again. Particularly happens a lot in foreclosures, because the bank forecloses, the people move out, and those houses tend to sit empty for 6 months to a year. And so they might be thinking, okay, I don't recognize this person that's coming to collect, so I'm going to send them packing. So maybe the owner gave them the benefit of the doubt and said, well, they didn't recognize him, so I'm going to make sure he sends I will send my son whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him. But not only did they give him the same treatment, beat him up, but they end up killing him. They don't just beat him up, rough him up, and he dies by accident, but this is premeditated murder. I mean, this is like the highest tier of felony, to premeditated murder rather than accidental manslaughter. I mean, how many CSIs and cold cases have I watched of, it's always, they have this plot again and again where somebody gets mad and hits somebody in the head with a pipe in a moment of anger, and then they collapse. Oh shoot, they're dead. What do? I don't want to go to prison, so I'm going to hide the body. I didn't mean to kill them, right? So no, this is premeditated. So this is serious stuff. So Jesus tells this story, this parable, and the people heard this and they said, God forbid. I've not heard one this bad before. And I've heard some stories. This is pretty bad, and the people are hearing this saying, God forbid. Now before we continue on, let's unpack the parable. The parable's a common story with deep spiritual meaning. So, the owner of the vineyard in the parable is God. God gets some tenants in a vineyard, and the tenants in the vineyard are basically us, or in this case, to be more precise, the leadership in Israel, as Jesus is addressing it at the time. So There are some expectations. The expectations that God gives to the tenants, i.e. us, is the law and the prophets. What's in the Bible? The expectations, the covenant between mankind and God. And then God comes to say what he wants or collect. God sends a servant, that would be his prophets and his leaders in the Old Testament. And what do? They beat them. We see in the Bible, more of the prophets than not had been run out of town. Some of them been beat up. Some of them been put to death. Jeremiah comes to town. They didn't like the message that he was prophesying from God. So they took him and they threw him in a well and left him there for a few days. It wasn't an easy job. The people who spoke God's word to the nation were mistreated again and again. So the owner of the vineyard sends a servant. He's beat up and sent away empty-handed, sends a second one, sends a third one. So in this parable, the spiritual meaning of it is God sending his prophets, them being ignored, sent away, beaten, and mistreated. So the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I'll send my son." So this is taking a big, wide look at human history of the nation of Israel. So the prophets have not been heeded or listened to. God's law has not been followed. They don't recognize the prophets as being from God. The kings of Israel didn't listen to them, didn't recognize them, accused them of being false prophets and speaking a false word, threw them out. And so the owner of the vineyard said, "Well, I'm going to send my son. Surely they will listen to him." So the prophets, the law of God hasn't been listened to, so God says, "I'm going to send my son Jesus." Surely they will listen to him. But what ends up happening? Jesus is teaching this less than a week before he ends up crucified and being put to death. He saw what was coming, and so he's giving them the why. He's telling them how it's going to work. So the owner of the vineyard sends his son. They said, "Let's kill him and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Jesus says, "What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others." So the bad tenants here are thinking like, well, if we kill the heir, then the vineyard will somehow be ours because he'll have nobody else to give it to. Well, that right there is some pretty delusional and misguided thinking, that we're going to kill his son, and so he's going to give it to us. And maybe he's not going to give it to them. Maybe there's some sort of legal wrangling they could do. Maybe there were some sort of squatters' rights. I don't know if that was a thing then. We have it now. People break into a vacant house or piece of property in the old days and put up a cabin, and if they're there long enough without being sent packing, then the property becomes theirs when they file in the courts for title. So they had some kind of scheme up their hands, but it's not going to work because the owner finds out about it. They killed his son. He's going to go in and kill those tenants. So how does this work, though, spiritually and theologically in the parable? God sends his son Jesus, and they kill him. God sends his one and only Son. God's prophets have not been listened to. His law is not being followed. He sent them prophets and they've mistreated them. He sends his Son and they kill him. So the vineyard being the earth, the tenants there being Israel, the vineyard being given to others after they've killed the Son is salvation and eternal life, and the new covenant being given to the Gentiles, being given to others here in the parable. So yeah, it's very, very serious business here. So the tenants thought that they get to decide who owns the vineyard. No, they don't. The man owns the vineyard. For goodness sake, who planted the vines? Who planted the vineyard? God, the owner. So it wasn't there to begin with. They were just there to harvest it and give him his share. That's quite a paradigm. Do you ever think of this? I mean, Jesus was addressing the religious leadership and the Sanhedrin and religious leadership's rejection of him, and them being responsible for having him crucified and put to death, and the gospel and God's plan turning into a new covenant with the Gentiles, the temple being torn down in 70 AD as part of God's judgment being brought about by the Romans, where the sacrificial system is destroyed then once and for all. You ever think about that and what its meanings are? God's our landlord and we're his tenants, and he expects something from us. He doesn't just accept it when we just want to ignore him, pretend everything we have is ours, and pretend God doesn't exist, and do things to offend him, ignore God's law, ignore the prophets, ignore the biblical writers. Well, Jesus said it plainly in Matthew chapter 23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous, Abel, to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all of this will come on this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often have I longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So they're building tombs where the prophets are buried to honor them. They're venerating them. They're pretending that they're better than their ancestors that had these prophets killed. It's a few generations later that they recognize that, hey, these were men of God. We would have never acted like that. We would have never killed them. We would have listened to them and done what they said. And Jesus was telling them, that's nonsense. It's utter nonsense. How did he know that? Because they're about to have Jesus killed, the Son of God that has come to set them straight, to accept God's message once and for all. Yet they end up killing him. And that's one temptation we have as believers. Same thing as them. We read the Bible, we read what they did to the prophets, we read about how they killed Jesus, and we think, surely if I was there then, I would never have taken part in that. But Jesus was saying to say that might be to delude yourselves, because people today, the society today, really follow God and heed his prophets better than they did back then? Well, not really. But the point of the temple, the Jewish nation, most of it anyway, the majority of it, and its leadership rejecting God's Son and being judged for it. But for us, looking back and reading this later, if God's the big landlord and we're his tenants, and he has a covenant with us and expects us to do things his way, do we honor it? Do we honor the covenant? I mean, that's the contract between us and God. Or are we wicked tenants? The wicked tenants are judged harshly. I mean, it wasn't very hard what was asked of them. Neither is it with us. As Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. God's pretty fair with what he expects from us. Yet, most people don't listen to his messengers. We have to be careful by how we treat God's messengers in the Bible. And then, when the people heard this, they said, God forbid. Verse 17. Jesus looked directly at them and asked, then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Talking about the Old Testament. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. The cornerstone of a building made of stone, the cornerstone supports two walls. If you remove the cornerstone, you decide to chisel out the cornerstone and have it removed, the walls fall down. The cornerstone's Jesus of the faith. So it says anyone who falls on that stone, you take out that stone, the building's going to fall down on them and they're going to be crushed. So Judaism, without Jesus as the cornerstone, you take that away, the building collapses. Two walls. Judaism's one wall. I would say the church is the other wall. The church without Jesus, his atoning work on the cross, the forgiving of our sins from his death and the shedding of his blood and the breaking of his body. We take Jesus out of the equation, the church crumbles and falls down. There's no leg for it to stand on. The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken a parable against them. But they were afraid of the people. And as Jesus is talking to the people, he's in the temple. Remember, he had just cleansed the temple. And he's there in the temple, and the temple leadership, which acted as the supreme court of the nation of Israel, they're there listening to him too. And they realized he had spoken judgment upon them. They saw it as him undermining their credibility. They were losing power. Jesus had just insulted them, and they wanted to do something about it. And it said in the previous passage that they're looking for a way to kill him. They want to arrest him, but they're afraid of the crowds that are gathered around, totally bought into Jesus and his message. So they don't dare arrest him there. They got to go keep an eye out and arrest him at night when he's not with so many people that could stop them. Keeping a close watch on him, verse 20, they sent spies who pretended to be sincere. So now they're trying to set traps for Jesus. But Jesus was wise to it. They had been trying to set traps for him all along. It says they hoped to catch Jesus in something he said so that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. Now remember, this wasn't a society where free speech was protected. You could say the wrong thing and get arrested for it, even put to death. They ultimately were accusing Jesus of being the king of the Jews and trying to frame him for a sort of insurrection, not understanding him to be a spiritual king, but of trying to overthrow the government. Yeah, we have freedom of speech now, but Jesus didn't do this, but this was what he was accused of. Try to overthrow the government, and then your speech isn't so free anymore. Treason's still a thing. So the spies question him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth." Now, these are spies sent to trap him. They're full of flattery, but Jesus sees right through them. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? So first we learn a lesson about bad tenants and its spiritual meaning, and next we learn about taxes. Interesting that Jesus is teaching profound spiritual truths through bad tenants and taxes. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? This is a good trick question. The Pharisees were teachers of the law. These people were just full of good, stupid questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. We all hear that in school, right? Yes, there is. It's just questions that you ask to mess with people. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? So let me break this down really quick. The Romans ruled over the Jewish nation. Nobody wanted them there. They invaded and took over, and they required taxes over and above, which went to Rome and went to Caesar. Now, why do countries then want to invade other countries? Well, to rule more territory and collect more taxes in order to get richer. So, paying taxes to Caesar when they believed that God had instituted the nation of Israel and given them kings was to support the Romans. There were, in Jesus' time and shortly after, several revolts and uprisings against the Romans. They had previously overthrown Greek rulership, then Rome invaded, and there are a lot of movements to try to overthrow the Romans. Now, paying taxes to Caesar, one, that's looked at as supporting the Romans or treason to the Jewish nation. There's no paying taxes to Romans in the Bible, which is God's law there. And two, there was a problem of Greek and Roman coins because they had images on them of emperors. And emperors, a lot of the emperors claimed to be gods and demanded that they be worshipped. So to have an image with somebody on it that claimed to be God was looked at as having an idol. You have a pocket full of Roman coins. Some of them felt that you have a pocket full of idols. Now, it's tricky because you want to buy something that was the currency of the day, the Greek and Roman coins. Now, go out there and try to barter. Bartering's just harder than having money. You know, You have something you want, and you're assuming you have something to trade that they want. Money just makes it a whole lot easier. So if Jesus said, no, it's not right to pay taxes to Caesar, then he's making the Jewish nationalists happy, but he's committing treason against Rome and telling people not to pay their taxes. Verse 23, and if he tells them, yeah, pay taxes to Rome, then they're seeing him as a traitor to the people, right? So, trick question. Total trick question here. Verse 23, he saw through their duplicity and said to them, show me a denarius. A denarius was a day's wage, typically what you would pay to a day laborer at the end of the day for their work. So he said, show me a denarius. So somebody gets one out and shows it to them. Might be like, hey, anybody have a $20 bill on them today? Or something like that. Yeah, most people are probably walking around with one. So he doesn't answer the question directly. Show me a denarius. Show me a coin. So they get it out. And he said, whose image and inscription are on it? Caesar's, they reply. He said to them, then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. They were unable to trap him in what he had said there in public, and astonished by his answers, they became silent. So he answered it in an indirect sort of way that astounded them. Whose image is on the coin? Caesar. Well, then give it to Caesar, and give to God what is God's. So he's implying that Caesar has a right to the coins with his picture on it, and give to God what is God's. What's that mean? Give to God what is God's. What is God's? I mean, what belongs to God? Just, yeah, good. You guys get it. Everything. The earth is his and all that's in it. Everything we could see. Everything that we have belongs to God. We're stewards of it, the Bible teaches. We just get to use it. We just get to use what's here. It belongs to God. The biblical teaching is that we don't actually own anything. It belongs to God. And we see in the previous parable that he just told, God's the owner, and we're the tenants. We're here as renters, and God's given us a deal that goes along with it. And to not follow it is a big problem. So he says, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. That's a tall order right there. To say, man, they realize this theology that everything belongs to God. So give God your all, is what he's saying. So the first parable here, like, how are we to treat God's message? How are we to treat God's messengers? And that to reject God's word, God's message, is to reject God himself, who owns and is over everything, including us, in our life. Hey, let's close this story with saying, hey, let's be good tenants. I mean, in the property management world, I mean, you do everything you can to screen and get good tenants. And they're a joy to deal with. You know, people who take good care of a place, people who follow the agreement. It's wonderful. And the bad ones out there, I mean, there's ones that sometimes break the contract, but they've fallen on hard times, and you can give them some grace. But then there's the bad ones that hate the landlord. There's people we would call professional renters. You know, they're the ones that look for mom and pop listings that seem like maybe they don't know what they're doing, you know, a less than professional ad and pictures. And they'll get in there because they know how to take advantage and live there a long time without paying here in California. You know, it's not like that everywhere. I had a coworker that she was fresh out of Louisiana, and she accompanied me to one of these legal seminars, and she's looking at me, what's going on? What's going on? And that's not how it works. I said, let's talk after. I'll get you up to speed on California. And she just said, I just can't believe that, you know, in Louisiana, if people don't pay, I mean, they're out by the end of the week. Actually takes a few days. How can it work that way here? I don't know, well, that's just how it works here. But yeah, I mean, don't be a bad tenant to God. Don't break his agreement. Render unto God, which is God. Give God your life. Honor him with it. He's a good owner. He's given us a beautiful world to live in. He's worthy of all glory, all respect, all praise, and all honor. Amen? All right, let's close with a final song, and then we'll have some announcements. And I want to just ask you if you'd like to get your life back on track with God and know him as your Savior. I just want to encourage you to come up and pray with me as we're closing, or if there's anything else you'd like prayer for, just encourage you to come up during the last song.